I would find it comforting to know that that was an option if it all became too much.
I think it undermines our commitment against suicide.
This month, Parliament will begin debating an assisted dying bill, a law change that would allow for people to be consensually euthanised in the UK. The practice is currently illegal, although there have only been 4 prosecutions for encouraging or assisting suicide in the UK since 2009. Although Keir Starmer has promised a free vote on the matter, he previously said that he was personally committed to changing the law on assisted dying. Meanwhile, Tory leader hopeful Robert Jenrick has criticised the proposal, commenting that in Europe, both children and the mentally ill are being euthanised. To hear both sides of the argument, I spoke to Emily Jackson, Professor of Law at LSE and proponent of legalised euthanasia, and Kevin Yuill, ex-Professor of History at the University of Sunderland and CEO of Humanists Against Assisted Suicide and Euthanasia.
So I think the thing that I find most persuasive is the idea that if it was legalised, it wouldn't just help the relatively small number of people who would actually use it and who experience intolerable suffering at the end of their life, that it would actually benefit a much wider group of people by reassuring them that if everything became too much, they could end it. Because I think one thing that really blights the end of people's lives is fear of what lies ahead, and fear of it just being overwhelmingly awful for them. And so I think the idea of assisted dying being legal, being comforting to a very wide range of people, I find quite persuasive. Personally, I would find it comforting to know that that was an option if it all became too much. And I'm sure that feeling will become more compelling for me as I get older.
First of all, I don't think it's very necessary, and I don't think it's very wanted as much as it's presented by the other side. It's done a lot through fear. It's people wanting it through fear of a bad death. And I don't think that that's that realistic. So it's not necessary. Second thing, it actually does real harm to people. So you have, for instance, in the Netherlands, an egregious example, admittedly, of at least 9 people who have been euthanized due to autism. So, for instance, there was a young man in his 20s who found it difficult to make social connections and who found it very, very difficult to cope after his parents died. And he requested and was euthanized. He requested euthanasia and was euthanized. And I think most people would be horrified by that. And I think what we don't see, we hear these stories of some good deaths from the Netherlands and from Canada and other areas where it's legal, but we don't see these sort of horrific deaths. And it divides people up into groups, whereby there's a group where they are considered, we're going to strenuously try and prevent your suicide. And then there's a group over here where we say, you know what, would you like some help up to the proverbial cliff edge, and we'll give you a push. And I think that is very, very unequal. And I think it undermines our commitment against suicide.
I imagine that the majority of proponents of assisted dying would sort of share your concern and would, I imagine, be in favour of some sort of regulatory mechanism to prevent sort of, unwanted or extreme uses of euthanasia. But just to clarify, does your position stretch as far as if we had an extremely terminally ill person, with weeks or months left to live, who was in a level of pain that, palliative care wasn't able to properly manage, would you still object to that person?
No, I mean, on an individual level, I think there are cases that where continued life isn't the best thing, even for the person. I think I'm not an absolutist about individual cases like that. And I think right now in Britain, we have a very good situation whereby there are no prosecutions for assisted suicides when it's not in the public interest. So there are situations where genuine mercy killings happen, where, and I would say we should look at those individually. What I'm opposed to is a change in the law, which I think does set us off on a different moral course. But there have been cases, particularly in the past, when it was much more necessary, where a doctor would give more pain relief than was actually necessary, perhaps in the interests of the patient not suffering, or they would up a dose to a relatively dangerous level. That doesn't happen so much now because partially because of a legal spotlight that assisted suicide actually shines on the death scene. It was much better before, when it was a fairly private affair. And I think this is one of the problems I have with legalized assisted suicide. It brings the legal spotlight and shines it on down to the deathbed scene.
What do you think of that? Is that a legitimate argument that that we already as British people have access to this, but it's just not a state or a law?
I'm afraid I would respectfully disagree with that for a number of reasons. So first, I think many palliative care doctors would dispute the fact that this is going on anyway. That they're giving levels of pain relieving drugs, for example, in quantities to kill people. So it's a contested idea that that's happening. So there's definitely disagreement there. But also, I think if you think something is acceptable, for it to go on in the shadows where there can't be any scrutiny, you can't have second opinions because the doctor is risking prosecution, you can't have openness, you can't collect data to find out what's going on, doesn't seem to me to be a very sensible way of dealing with an issue.
A lot of the time, critics of assisted dying programs bring up MAID in Canada. Canada has one of the more expansive systems of sort of euthanasia, and it's one where there are plans to potentially widen it to include people with long-standing mental health problems. Is MAID a good example of a euthanasia program?
So I think what it's a good example of is the fact that different countries can choose to legislate for this in different ways. There are lots of different models for assisted dying legislation, and it's up to a country which is thinking about legalising assisted dying to look at those models and think about what is best for them. So the fact that there are countries with more expansive eligibility criteria, and those would be Canada, Netherlands and Belgium, doesn't mean that that's the only way to do it. There are also lots of other countries, for example Australia and New Zealand, with much more restrictive criteria. There's quite a lot of evidence in Canada of public support for MAID, because I think as people experience their loved ones having peaceful deaths through assisted dying, you tend to get more people thinking, well, this is not just some scary thing that happens somewhere else, but something that happens in my community and which some people can see people have benefited from. So I'm not sure it would be true to say that everybody in Canada thinks that MAID is terrible at all.
Canada is a sort of negative poster child, if you like, for euthanasia and assisted suicide, in that you've seen the numbers rise absolutely dramatically. You've seen all of the promised safeguards just thrown off by the wayside. The cases coming out of Canada, I mean, of course, if you say this is medical treatment for unbearable suffering, anybody who's suffering unbearably, and of course that's an entirely subjective thing. A doctor can't tell you you're suffering or you're not suffering. That's up to you. So if a person is suffering as they have been from poverty, how can they really tell somebody, well, you're not suffering enough to get an assisted death? If the laws come through in Britain, there's every chance that that will happen there too. Canada is just the most egregious example. But it has expanded, the criteria have expanded everywhere where it's been legalized, even Oregon, which is this sort of positive poster child for many people trying to pass legislation here.
One of the big questions with assisted dying is which groups of people should be allowed to use those systems. So I guess the common example is a terminally ill patient who's going to be dying soon anyway. But then there are some people who argue that essentially anyone who deeply feels that they want their life to end should be able to seek that in a dignified manner. For you, where is that line drawn?
So I think it's probably somewhere between those two extremes. But I understand the impulse to say it should only be available to people who are near the end anyway. The problem with that, though, is that there are people who are suffering unbearably who you wouldn't categorise as terminally ill. So I think if you restrict it to the terminally ill, you're going to have people who will feel aggrieved that it's not an option for them. And if I could take an example, one of the most significant legal cases in the UK was a case from a few years ago involving somebody called Tony Nicklinson, and it went all of the way to the Supreme Court. And he died before the Supreme Court hearing. He stopped eating and drinking. He wouldn't have qualified for an assisted death with a terminal illness requirement. But there was absolutely no doubt that he was suffering truly intolerably. So I think if you restrict it to people who are terminally ill, you are going to have people who are missed by that. On the other extreme that you gave me is anybody who thinks that this should be an option for them. I don't think that would be acceptable. And the reason for that is that doctors are healthcare professionals who have various obligations as a result of that role. I think the doctor has to share the patient's view that their suffering has become intolerable and unrelievable, that there's nothing you can do to make that better before it becomes acceptable for a doctor to help a patient to die.
If you're going to provide this for one group of people, you've got to provide it for all if you want to be seen to be equal, which I think most of us who count themselves as liberals do. So I think that's the real problem, is that it will expand simply because it's logical for it to expand. Of course, a 28-year-old who's heartbroken over a lost love affair, it wants that for themselves as well. And I can't see that there's a moral way of saying that's less legitimate than you're suffering over there. And this is one of the problems with it. It categorizes life as of differential value. So in homicide laws, if you have somebody murders an 86-year-old who doesn't value their life, it's no less wicked an act than murdering a 24-year-old who has everything to live for. It's the killing it's the taking of a human life that's wrong. We probably all feel like it's suicidal at some stage of our lives. That's just the nature of things, and we rely on other people to help us out there, and not to sort of say, well, if you're feeling suicidal, let me help you. I think that's what we risk losing as a society, is our connection to other people and our commitment to protecting people from violence, and from violence that sometimes comes from themselves as well as from others.
It isn't that there is one group who for whom this is an option and one group who isn't, because frankly this is potentially an option for all of us. It's potentially an option for me, certainly, and so the line, I think, is drawn between people who are voluntarily requesting this, who want it, and people who don't want it. And there's no reason why anybody who doesn't want it should have access to it if you have proper safeguards in place to make sure that this is really what somebody wants. And that can be done in all sorts of ways. You can have psychiatric assessments, you can have second opinions, you can have waiting periods, you can have eligibility checks of all different sorts. So all sorts of safeguards you could put in place to make sure this is truly what somebody wants.